Welcome to The Learning Curve.
A podcast about insights, inspiration and innovation in higher education. My name is Famke Poel.
My name is Sharon Klinkenberg. We are lecturers communication science at the University of Amsterdam.
And we work for the Teaching and Learning Center of the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Welcome to another episode of our podcast. And today we will talk about formative assessment, or more specifically, assessment as, for, or of learning. Hi Sharon, how are you?
Good morning, I'm good. I just lectured for 4 hours straight back to back, so I'm a little bit tired, but
I
now
can hear that.
at least I can sit down, so that's good.
That's good, yeah. So are you up for some more talking
Yes,
or
bring it
listening? Well, you're used to interactive lectures, of course, so it's not just sending. You would love some interaction in this podcast.
Oh yeah, so we'll make it a good conversation.
We'll make it a good conversation.
About formative assessment,
Yes.
which is pretty important and which I rely on heavily in my own courses.
Yeah.
But today you wanted to emphasize the as and the of and the for. Exactly.
Exactly.
So maybe you should give us an overview. What is the difference?
What is the difference? Well, I think, let me start with saying that in my own teaching, I've been using formative assessment in different ways. And also inherited a lot of the formative assessment from people who gave my courses before me. And it's often graded formative assessment. So there's a test in a tutorial group, for example, and students can get a grade for that. Or it's handing in a paper or part of a paper and they already get a grade for that. And it's often called formative assessment. And that is assessment of learning, basically, in my opinion, and that's more summative assessment, in my opinion. So the difference between formative and summative assessment is either something you do as an instructor, as a teacher, to get an idea of where are my students right now and what do they need from me, what type of instruction do they need to get further towards the goal they and I have. And summative assessment is assessing whether students understand the content or have enough knowledge about the content. And it's a final test, basically.
Yeah, so at the one hand you have determining the final grade, determining
Yes.
if they actually got the learning goals, outcomes of the course, and then assess based on that, indeed. So there's indeed a fundamental difference between the two, but both is essentially assessment, but how you use it, what you use it for, can be different.
Yeah. So I would say assessment of learning is summative assessment, and assessment as or for learning is formative assessment, where the difference is that assessment for learning, that is, for example, using WooClap or Mentimeter or Kahoot in a lecture or tutorial group to see what your students understand or what type of knowledge they already have, and then making sure that your instruction fits the level of knowledge or understanding that the students have. So it gives you an idea, okay, this is where my students are now, so this is what I need to focus on in my class. And assessment as learning is basically the assessment for students. It gives students the necessary information for them to know where am I at. And it should trigger, if we approach it in a good way, their metacognitive thinking of, okay, I don't understand this yet. What study approach did I use? Or maybe I didn't study at all, so I need to do something now. And, it should start that metacognitive process. And it is actually intended for learning how to learn.
Okay.
So there's a difference there. So the as focus more, assessment as focuses more on students, basically, but it's something that the teacher does, so the student can focus on that, although it can also be peer assessment, could even be self-assessment. And the assessment for is basically what the teacher does to get a better grasp of what do I need to focus on in educating my students right now.
Yeah, so in my view, this should essentially be integrated. So where you...
I agree with the integration.
Yeah, so it should essentially be integrated where the things that you let students do, the assignments that you give them, should provide an indication of diagnostic information.
Yes.
Where are you on the learning goals?
Yeah.
Which should be available to students, but also to the teacher. So in that sense, students can use that information and teachers can also use that information.
Yes.
So ideally you would have the assessment parts connected to your learning goals, and you would indicate what percentage their level essentially is on those learning goals.
Yeah, it could be a percentage or just an insight, or it can be done in different ways, of course. I know you do it in terms of percentages, I guess, but you have them clearly linked to the learning goals.
Yes.
But that actually, I would like to take a sidestep now, because you're specifically mentioning learning goals, which of course, especially for the, the teacher of course knows what the learning goals are. And most teachers communicate the learning goals to their students. In the course syllabus, for example, some teachers take it a step further and they do it at the start of a course again, and then some teachers take it a step further and they do it for every class, which is even better. But the thing is, are these learning goals really clear to our students, and do the students have the same goal as the instructor has? Because if you don't have a clear goal, then the assessment as learning does not take place. If you do not have a clear goal, you don't know where you are going as a student, which also means you cannot interpret the feedback that you're getting from a quiz, for example, or the instruction a teacher gives after a quiz. You don't know what to do with that. And it also does not help you in that sense to think of the idea like, am I on the right track? What does my study progress look like? Am I using the right strategies? So the cues, the diagnostic cues that you are referring to don't make sense when the student doesn't know or doesn't have a clear goal.
But that's also in terms of design, right? You should be clear as a teacher what the goals are. And when communicating back, you're at level percentage X on the learning goal for being able, for example, to interpret outputs from SPSS.
Yeah, for example.
Which can be with different analysis, but your learning goal of being able to interpret output, that you still need to work on. So that is something that you, if you provide that information, is a clear indication of the student what is going well and what's not going well. This is an interesting part, because it's not evidently clear what the connection is between learning strategy and what the student needs to do in terms of if it's not working. So I'm really interested.
What you were giving now an example of a pretty straightforward learning goal. A student needs to be able to interpret the output of an analysis, right? A statistical learning goal. And we're both statistics teachers, so to us this makes perfectly normal sense, also with a lot of experience in research and analysis, of course. And the students, especially when you think about, for example, first-year students, they have no clue what interpreting output means, right? So this for them is already too vague. So what am I working forward to? So this is a sidestep from what I wanted to talk about today, but it's an important sidestep because I think if you're not clear about what you're working towards. Absolutely. So if for the student this is too vague, then you can formative assess
all
the heck
you
out
want.
of it, all you want, but for the student, it won't matter that much. So that's an important element, I think, an important aspect in the assessment as learning, that for the students it is clear, and they should also be supported in setting these goals themselves, thinking about these goals, but also reflect on these goals. So, for example, you use a quiz or you have an assignment that your students make in class and they get some feedback for it. You as a teacher know, okay, they don't understand this part yet of what I'm trying to explain, so I'm focusing on that more. But the student should also see and be able to reflect and actually also be asked to reflect on it, to actually start that metacognitive process so that they start the learning process.
Yeah. But at the one hand, you're saying you should be clear in formulating your learning goals and making that absolutely, 100% interpretable also for students on their level. And that sounds obvious to me. But the next step is, if you want students to reflect on their own learning goals and what they need to do, so essentially the, what's this term for this? The
feed forward?
No, it's about being able to plan your own study and
the self-regulation.
Exactly, the self-regulation.
We haven't used that. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. Self-regulation, people.
So what do you need to do to prime students to think about this self-regulation process in the light of giving this feedback? Because I've been doing this for years where I connect the learning goals to the outcomes and the students can see it in one way or the other, or the teacher can see it in one way or the other. And, some students just ignore it, right? So, we have information on Canvas, but I don't know.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting space where the question is more what can we do in our course design, also in the digital form, to connect these two and make sure that students actually stay on track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to go immediately into the digital form, for example, or what it would look like in an online learning environment, for example. But, well, you already used the term self-regulation, and the topic of this podcast episode is assessment as for learning, formative assessment. But the main reason for that is that it can either trigger the metacognitive thinking, which is really important, but for that you also need self-regulation skills to be able to do that. And I want to quote someone here, and it's in the Netherlands at this moment, I think among educators already a famous quote, but I also learned that this person, Patrick Sins, lecturer at Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences, learned this or got this quote from someone else, but self-regulated learning is something that you cannot learn in a self-regulated way. Right?
Yeah, sure.
And what do we do as a university? We expect our students to come here to be intrinsically motivated, which I could have another podcast about, but don't expect your students to be intrinsically motivated. We expect that they are independent. We expect that they do everything we ask them to, that they prepare for everything, that they create perfect plannings, etc. But what we forget is that these students come from high school, either in the Netherlands or internationally. They have different levels, and they haven't always been really guided in becoming self-regulated learners. But then even if they have been guided in high school, the subject matter and the level of education in university is completely different. So I believe we cannot expect these students to be perfect self-regulated learners. So what we need to do is also teach them how to self-regulate. When they can do that, they can actually set their own goals. They can set the goals linked to our learning goals. They can understand them. Then there's room for interpreting assessment as learning. And then they can also activate their metacognitive thinking about their own learning, which again informs their self-regulated learning.
Yeah, so would you also say that the whole formative assessment we actually use just to make sure that they stay on track, and we design the process, which we talked about in earlier podcasts, because they are still not able to self-regulate?
Yes.
And in terms of your curriculum build-up, I think especially in the courses we give, which are pretty large, you have to start out by guiding and then taking slow steps to give the self-regulation more space and also teach students how to do that. So going from a lot of formative assessment to guide the process, to more self-regulated, going somewhere from the end of year 2 into the bachelor thesis and the master thesis. So
yeah, but I want to raise another point that I find very important personally here, is that I can indeed see that we use a lot of formative assessment, what we call formative assessment, with small graded assignments and quizzes, etc., and with the intent to have students prepare. And I just don't believe in that system, because they're doing it for a grade. They're doing it because they have to. And just simply looking at self-determination theory from Ryan and Deci, it shows us that it's then actually influencing a controlled motivation, which is a low level of external motivation. And as I said, you shouldn't expect students to all come here and being intrinsically motivated. But what we can do in our system, in our educational system, is actually to foster a higher motivational quality, so more autonomous motivation, which is still partly extrinsic motivation. But students then do it because it's personally important to them. So when you, for example, right, it's personally important to them, or they identify with certain goals. So when you can make those learning goals personally relevant and really clear to them, instead of something that you just need to do to pass this course and in the end get your degree, but if you make it more personally relevant, then that triggers a different type of motivation, which then also helps in the self-regulation. But the self-regulation indeed also helps in creating that motivation. I see it kind of as a circle, and that's why I also, and this is not something I came up with, but this is something that plays an important role in primary school in the Netherlands, in high school, so secondary education, is not to talk about formative assessment anymore. Step away from the assessment because it triggers the idea of you are being assessed, but talking about formative evaluation or acting, where it's set apart from giving grades, but it's really focused on informing the instructor and informing the students. Yeah. So the motivation for students is not to do this because you get a grade or because you have to, but because it's informing you. Yeah.
I have two remarks on this, because the first one is that when we think about formative assessment, it's often in terms of a kind of mock exam or some from separate questions, and I think that it's good to think about formative assessment a much wider spectrum. Also, if you look at let me state it differently. If you see it as a learning module, a didactic learning module, you can integrate questions in that module, and then it has a clear didactic path that they need to follow. And if you set it up like that, students won't feel as if it is assessment, because it's just a learning tool that they use. But in the meantime, you can use those results as a teacher to see how are they doing on the different topics.
And then also act on that.
Exactly.
That is also very important.
And the acting is something we can go into later. But the other point I wanted to make, and that has to do, of course, with the emphasis on the assessment, especially for these formative tasks. So I stepped away from this. We've talked about this at different points already, where I essentially provide, a sort of deduction scale, where I say you have to do the preparatory work, and you get deduction points if you don't do it. So it's not about how good you do it. So you're allowed to make mistakes. This morning I talked about this in my lecture to the students. I said them, you're allowed to make mistakes. This is part of the learning process. But I do want you to put in the efforts because, and that is what we essentially reward with such a deduction scale, where you, for example, give students credit points already at the start of the course. And when they miss one thing that doesn't have consequences, but if you miss two or more, then you lose a few of those credit points, for example. So that triggers this loss aversion strategy by Tversky and Kahneman, which is pretty effective in getting people motivated to essentially keep the credits that they got.
But then my question is, but that would be a different podcast episode. Like, what type of motivation are you triggering then? Is it still the low external motivation, or is it an autonomous motivation? And
I would say that it's intended to steer in the direction of internal motivation. But when you're in the first or second year class, then especially if these groups are so large, you need a kind of nudging to get students on tracks, because if you don't, it just doesn't work. So I would say it would need to work in the direction of autonomous.
Yeah, exactly. I could think of a different strategy here where you wouldn't work with deduction points, but you would let students write a short reflection on what went well and what went wrong after every assignment.
Yeah, we do that
and that is something that they have to do.
Yeah, we do that too. But then again, the have to do is, are you going to give them points or not? And then, if I have to do, I just write down something. So for me, it's more making absolutely fundamentally clear you can make mistakes.
That is important.
That is the main point, but you have to put in effort. Yeah. And that's non-negotiable.
Yeah. We're drifting away a little bit now. We have so much to tell about this, and we want to always record short episodes, right? So that people can listen to them while commuting, for example. Yeah,
but we did the lecture thing in a 3-part series, so maybe
Let's do this as well.
Come back to this at a later point.
Although, as a promise to our listeners, I asked for a Lego podcast as well, so there will be a Lego podcast episode as well.
On the serious play with Lego, that would be awesome.
But to get back to our topic, I think an important distinction is to know for our listeners that assessment of learning, that is what we know as summative assessment. You're assessing whether your students meet the final criteria or set goals for your course, for example. And the assessment as and for is something that informs both instructors or teachers and students of where students are at that moment in their learning process, where assessment as learning is actually also mainly focused at helping students learn how to learn and develop in that area. And I think, so I'm curious also what you think about that, Sharon, but I think that both as and for, but specifically also as learning, is something where we can still win a lot as higher education teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. But for me, it also ties into, you mentioned WooClap, for example. So for me, if you let students do assignments, I think it's really important to make sure that you have the information of the assessment available back to the students. And so everything you do where you lose the data, essentially, you shouldn't do that, in my opinion. So even if you would use a WooClap kind of assessment, it still needs to feed back to the students on a personal level, what their scores were, what went well and what didn't went well. So really trying to have a integrated approach to providing this information back to the students.
So that it can also go back to their scores and say, okay, today in class I didn't do well on this assignment, and what does that mean, and I want to reflect
but it's not just on the assignment. What learning specific goal in that assignment went well and what didn't? Because it could be that, well, on the writing part it was okay, but in the reasoning part it was not okay.
Exactly.
So, and that should be clear.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that asks for kind of a redesign of a course, I guess, if you want to work with it. But I want to highlight, we're also all about the quick wins. And I think if you want to start making a distinction, then something like WooClap or just talking to your students could already help. So I would like to challenge our listeners in your next class, whether it be a tutorial group or a lecture, or even maybe just a conversation with a thesis student, to see if you can plug in some type of formative element where you ask your student a question and see how they respond to that, and then also try to change the next step of your instruction to that. And then more importantly, and this is something that is highlighted in a model from Toetsrevolutie from Valentina de Viet and René Knijper, who say you need a follow-up action as well. Or a follow-up testing again to see after your instruction, did it work? Indeed. And that is something we often don't do, and I think that's an important part as well. So maybe you can do that just with a small thing in your class, just to see how it works and what it does to your students.
I will try that.
Nice.
So we'll keep it at that for now?
We keep it at that for now. And talk to you next time.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Learning Curve.
Produced by the Teaching and Learning Center of the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Amsterdam.
Our music was provided by Peter van Dijk.
For more information, find us wherever you get your podcasts.